I want to go to a little bit about roles again because this is a little more hockey specific now. Um, so we talked a little bit about it last week um, on having guys. We were talking about in terms of you have your team identity and then assigning roles based on team identity. But what we're talking about here, I want to put more of like the how it will affect the individual player slant to it, because not every individual is suited for every type of role. So first, I guess I would ask you talk a little bit about the different kinds of roles because maybe people aren't even familiar about what specifically. Like the example we always use is the power forward, but maybe we could talk about different forward defenseman roles that exist just in case people don't know. And then maybe like what types of kids are better suited for certain roles, and even a role could be not even a positional thing; it could be like a leadership role versus not. You know, because like some kids could really handle being a leader, and some kids might not be able to, even though you think they are a good leader or whatever. So you could talk about roles a little bit in that sense, and then um, we mentioned this last week too about not you don't want to limit the kid by putting them in a role necessarily, but then you could talk a little bit about balancing that kind of thing where it's like, okay, you're good, like here's your strengths, and this is the kind of role that I feel like you could fit into well, without saying like you can never try to stick handle because I think you're a power forward
Yeah.
or whatever
Yeah.
along those lines.
Yeah, I think like when you're young, the younger you are, the less roles you have, right? You're not going to sit here as a 7 to 10-year-old or 11-year-old necessarily and say like you're a defensive shutdown D. Like, I quit hockey then,
Yeah.
right? That's not what you're trying to do. But you're. I think it's when you get to. I'm just trying to think young here. I don't want to overcoach a young kid, but I'm just saying once you get over like 11 to 12 ish, there's kids that move up the roster because they're just offensively gifted. Let's say they could be center, wing, D, who doesn't really make a difference. That's more of an offensive guy. Now you want to teach them the other side of the puck as well. And then there's some guys that they couldn't stick handle if their life depended on it. They got muffins for a shot. They have no offensive instinct whatsoever. So like obviously that's where rules sort of come from, right? You're kind of more defensive or more offensive, but of course as a coach you want to teach both. You want them to be good at both. But having said that, at every level, you can if someone's the perfect player for their ability, then they're playing. What I mean by that is if they're playing the perfect game for their ability, you're still going to have guys that are going to be the offensive guys, and you're going to have guys that are better defensively. That's just the way it is. So that's where your rules start to come in. So it's how you approach it sometimes is going to make the difference of what you get out of a player. So it's not about putting a kid in a box and saying this is what you are. What it is about identifying through the team that this is where I see you fit to make our team better. So that doesn't mean because you're a defensive defenseman that you can never carry the puck up the ice more than 5 feet, right? That doesn't mean that at all. It just means that it's very, very important, Eric, that you, the defense, like, so it's not about, it's important. It's about, this is where I really see your strengths. That's a good thing, right? That's the good thing. You're bringing them out. And I think if you look at a player, like, so the way to make it even better is if you're in, I'm just thinking of a team, if you're playing for the Guelph Storm last year, then you look at like one of our shutdown defensemen, right? Like they say Reeser a couple of years ago that played with Charlie, 6'5" defenseman that block shots. So if you're a kid in Guelph, right? And you go like if like who I see you like is Ashton Reeser for the Guelph Storm. Watch how much he gets involved, block shots. No one scores when he's on the ice. Like it's a really good attribute. Now the kid's like, oh, that might be a cool thing to do, right? So now you're not because it's not about minimizing. Oh, we can't do anything else but block shots. It's like here's a real good strength of yours, and there's a guy that's very successful in hockey. If you do that, you can be like that guy, and then you can build off of that. If you get a little offensive upside as we go, then great. But really, right now, this is what I really see how you fit into our team and being really good at it. Like we need guys like you. Now you made that role great.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think as a coach, you're kind of talking about explaining the importance of what some people would view as like a lesser role. And what's interesting too is like even at youth hockey, when kids start to develop into their strengths, if they play into those, they'll probably be more offensive anyways. And this is something that a lot of players don't really understand, is that it if like I when I think of I'll think about Charlie for as an example, because I remember watching him through youth hockey, and like he still played like a power forward, right? So he put up way more offensive numbers in AAA because it's a way lesser level than the OHL, but his style of play was still suited to be a power forward. So he still made plays, he still scored a lot of goals, he still got all that offensive prowess about him, but he was still in that
He was
power
always in the
forward type
mix. Yeah.
of player, right?
Back check.
Whereas
And
like another guy like Newsy that he played with,
yeah, he was a water
he was
bug.
always a little water bug, slippery stick handle, sauce, like these types of things. And he got his points. And it was like two very different styles of play, both equated to a lot of offensive output for that team, you know? And I think that's something that people would do well to understand, just because you're a defensive defenseman, for example, in youth hockey, like if you block a shot and make a good first pass, maybe that's an assist off the rush, you know? And like, so these things lead into offense because oftentimes, especially in youth hockey, if you're the best players just get the points. So if you're one of the best defensive players, you'll probably end up being an offensive player anyways, just because you'll be a better player, you know? And I think for coaching, you can explain those types of things and how they're important so that kids don't think of them necessarily as a lesser role, right? And you don't have to explain it in terms of goals and points and stuff like that. It's just you're much better at passing than shooting, right? You're much better at shooting than passing. Or you're much better at hitting and making space for other people than carrying the puck yourself. You know, like these are things that can be explained to kids as they start to develop into their skill set. And you do need to keep in mind, the only caveat I'll say to that for coaches is like you might also be wrong about what you think about this player. So you have to be open minded to not box them in, which is a really important caveat to that, right?
Yeah. The other thing is, like, as you're talking about that, it's like, so when parents look at lines, first line, second line, third line, right? So if you take the fastest, most highly skilled guys that are more shooters, let's say they're goal scorers, and you put them on the first line, that might not be the greatest mix. So like, I'm going to Guelph Storm again. If you're a passer and you play with Matt Poitras, that might not be the best combination because Potsy had 97 assists or 87 assists this year. So if you're with him, you be ready to shoot the puck.
Because someone's got to shoot.
Someone's got to shoot.
Yeah.
So you could have maybe the left winger that's on his line might be just a pure shooter, whereas maybe the guy that's on the second or third line is actually a better player both ways. But because he's on the first line doesn't mean that he's a first line player. He is, but it doesn't mean like that's because the three best guys on the team are on the first line. It's not necessarily what it means. It means that if you're thinking about it, this guy can click with this guy and this guy. This guy, oh, now we're on the second line. So mom and dad, don't freak out. It's not a bad thing necessarily. It could be, I guess, but it's like, think of it a little bit bigger, right? So as coaches, when you put guys together, it's like that's part of the equation, right? So the role thing is like explaining that stuff. It's like, you're on you're on this. If you want to call it the second line, it's the second line, but it's the combination that's more important. You work with him, and like you work together, and then you have success.
I have a good example of that when I played. I don't know if people would remember the name. Mattia Marcantoni was a kid I played with. He was a high pick in the OHL draft. I think he still plays in the AHL. I don't know if he's still there or moved over, whatever. Anyways, and I think it was Chris Marchese was the other guy.
Cheese dog.
Yeah, Cheese.
Yeah.
So those two guys played on the Marlies.
Yeah.
They were my year, and it was exactly that dynamic where Marcantoni would wheel and deal, and Marchese would just sit in the slot and just wait. He would just get the puck, rep, scored. Ridiculous shot. So Marcantoni would buzz around, get the puck, make a play, sauce, whatever, and then Marchese would just be floating around in the honey hole, waiting for his shot, get it, rip. And what's funny is they complemented each other so well, so they were so dominant in youth hockey. And then they got to the OHL, and then Marcatoni went to, I believe it was Kitchener, and Marchese went, I forget where, but then Erie, and then he ended up on the Spits, and they never found that dynamic again, you know. So they were still both good players in the OHL. They both played their full career, whatever. And they were good players, but it was never the same level of dominance because maybe they were never put in that position where it's like, okay, a wheel and deal guy with a shooter, or a wheel and deal guy with a shooter with a guy that can make some space, or whatever the dynamic needs to be for them to be successful. And that can happen a lot in youth hockey. You can set those up as the coach. You can try to set up those types of dynamics and explain it. And the explaining is what's important, because if you don't, it could be like, yeah, but his best friend is not on his line anymore, or whatever the situation is. They need to understand. So you can say, okay, I see you as a guy that carries the puck well. I see you as a guy that shoots well, and I see you as a guy that goes to the net well. And that's obviously like the perfect trifecta that I could explain. Obviously, you won't necessarily have that perfect balance on all three lines, but those are the types of things that you can try to shape within the team that you have, because then you're developing guys in different roles, and you might have guys that are bigger, smaller, faster, slower, better shooters versus not, and you can start pushing them into their strengths a little bit more while still giving them the freedom to like try to make a play. Like if the kid tried to do a toe drag and screwed it up, it's like, it's okay. He tried to make a play and he screwed it up. You know, I used that example last week too. It was like, if the guy does it tries to make a play at a bad time or a bad position on the ice, that's one thing where you teach them. But if they're like in the corner and they try to make a play, it's like, you're gonna be mad that they tried to make a play. Like you shouldn't really, you know. So, anyways, that's those are kind of my thoughts on the roles thing, I guess. Do you have anything else about, I don't know, either whether it's limiting growth or like roles on the team or how to balance that with
Well, you
line stuff
mentioned
like that?
leadership, right?
Yeah.
So I'm not a big fan of naming captains or anything, but like look at leadership a different way, right? When the game's on the line, what players do you count on? Like if you're trying to win a game, and or a championship game or the playoff game or whatever, you'll notice that some kids aren't built for that, right? So if you're going to the guy that had a great regular season or played really well, like because you can disguise a lot of your true hockey playing, like when it's not important, like when the pressure's on, can you perform? So if you notice, like in the bigger games or whatever, you got a guy that's really uptight, and or maybe you don't notice, but you're like, because he was the goal scorer, the big guy on the team, and you're like before the game, okay, we need you here, man. We need you to have a big game. That could throw him right off, right? So it's understanding as a coach, understanding your players as well. Like you got to watch who's in the bigger games, in the moments where it really counts. Who kind of gets nervous, who gets scared, who gets doesn't want to make the mistake and stuff like that. So like from that perspective, knowing your team in that way is a good idea, because some kids will never say it. Who would, right? Are you scared of anything, Eric? No, right? That's the answer. Like no one wants to show fear or inferiority. I know, I know. I'm just reading a lot lately, right? No one wants to show weakness, right? So no one's going to sit there and say like, "Don't play me in overtime." But kids actually, a ton of guys don't get me out there. So like kind of knowing your team, so that's why you got to observe your kids in roles. Like so that now that role is that we need to win a game, we need to shut down, right? The goal is to protect this 1 goal lead with the last minute and a half. Don't make it, guys. We cannot, like, so that message of don't make a mistake for some guys, it's like, okay, I can't make a mistake, and then they're screwed, right? So some guys can handle the pressure. So it's like knowing those kind of roles too, right?
Yeah, that's a good point. I didn't even really think of
Well,
that.
no, for sure. And then
Yeah.
it's like, yeah. So there's a lot of stuff. There's so many ways to look at things, right?
Yeah. Well, we talked about some of the personality stuff, and we talked about roles and whatever during the game. Is there any other, when it comes to the players, anything else that you think we should touch on in terms of either of those two things, personality types, roles, whatever? Anything come to mind? Not
No,
really.
I mean like the other on the ice would be like also like penalty kill versus PK versus 5-on-5 and all that kind of stuff. Like sometimes your role is just not suited for that as much. Like I mean, we're youth hockey; everyone needs to play, but when talking down to the crunch time, right? But I think it's important that like if you're trying to win hockey games, put people in places where they can succeed, and or where your team can succeed as well. So like, yeah. Anyways.